There is a particular kind of man nobody warns you about, not in the books on success, not in the talks on leadership, not in the friends who have spent the last 20 years quietly competing with you and would not, if you asked them honestly, know how to answer the question you have actually been carrying. You sit at 43 in your kitchen at 11 at night. The house is quiet. The wife is asleep. The children are asleep. The dog is asleep. The day was, by every external measure, a good day. The meeting went the way you wanted. The numbers came in. The colleague who has been quietly undermining you for 6 months made a small, visible mistake. You drove home in the dark and you put the leftovers in the refrigerator and you sat down at the kitchen table and you opened a beer you did not particularly want. And then, in the precise quiet of the kitchen at 11 at night, you understood something you have been not understanding for at least 4 years. You understood that the life you built, the career, the house, the family, the standing, is the life you chose at 25, and the person who chose it is not the person sitting at the kitchen table at 11 at night, and the distance between those two people is the strangeness you have been carrying that no one in your life has the language to name. You are not unhappy. That would be the wrong word. You are not depressed. You are not in crisis. You are not, by any clinical or conventional measure, failing. You are, by every external measure, succeeding. You are simply, in the deepest place, no longer the person whose life you are currently living. This is what Carl Jung spent the last 30 years of his clinical work writing about. He called it the second half of life, the developmental moment, usually arriving between 38 and 46, when the adult identity built in the first half begins to require dismantling, and the man who has been wearing that identity has to learn, almost from scratch, how to begin building the one that will carry him into the second half. Jung was clear about what the dismantling required. It was not blowing up the life. It was not quitting the job. It was not leaving the wife. It was something quieter and harder and more precise. The dismantling required the surrender of 5 specific things. 5 identities and 5 attachments the man had been carrying since his mid-20s without realizing he was carrying them. And only when those 5 things were quietly set down did the actual self, the one nobody had met yet, begin to walk into the room. This video is about those 5 things. By the end, you will know exactly what Jung said every man over 40 must surrender. You will know why the surrender almost never feels like the dramatic decision the culture had taught you to expect. You will know the body sign each surrender brings. You will know what arrives, finally, when the 5 things are set down. And you will know why the men who refuse the surrender, and most do, spend the second half of their life inside an identity that does not quite fit them anymore, while the men who do the surrender, slowly and patiently, arrive at the only version of themselves the first half was never going to permit. If you are a man somewhere between 38 and 48, and you have been sitting in your own kitchen at 11 at night with a beer you did not particularly want, and a thought you cannot yet share with anyone, this is the conversation Jung would want you to find. Jung divided adult life into 2 distinct developmental halves, and he was clear that almost all of conventional psychology and self-improvement was written for the first half, not the second. The first half, roughly age 18 to 38, was about building an outer structure. You picked a path, took a job, found a partner, established a place in the world, built a story about yourself that the world could recognize and reward. The work was real. The work was necessary. Without it, no foundation existed for anything else. Jung was not dismissing the first half. He was saying that the first half was not the whole story. The second half, roughly 38 onward, was about something almost the opposite. The outer structure was by then mostly built. The career was launched. The family was forming. The story was written. What remained was the long, slow work of meeting the actual self that had been quietly developing underneath the outer story, and that had become, by the late 30s, the person who needed to inhabit the second half. The problem, Jung observed, was that the first half identity did not by itself step aside to let the second half self arrive. The first half identity had been built to win first half competitions, and it was good at it, and it did not, by its nature, know when to stop. So the man at 40 arrived at the developmental transition still wearing, almost unconsciously, the identity of the 25-year-old who had built the life. The identity worked. The world still rewarded it. The man could continue wearing it for the next 30 years, and many men do. But the actual self underneath, having matured into someone the identity did not fit anymore, slowly began to ache. Jung wrote, and this is the line he wrote with particular care, that the ache was not a problem to be solved. The ache was the call to the second half. Most men, having no language for the ache, misread it. They read it as a marriage problem, or a career problem, or a depression problem, or a need for a new car. Sometimes it was one of those things. Usually it was deeper. The ache was the actual self trying, quietly, to come up through the surface, and the first half identity standing in the way. The 5 surrenders below are how the first half identity is slowly set down. It is worth saying, before the 5 surrenders begin, that Jung did not think the second half was for everyone. Some men spent the entire second half still wearing the first half identity, performing it gamely into their 60s and 70s, and never made the transition. They had their reasons. The reasons were often understandable. The cost, though, was that they spent the back half of their life increasingly distant from the actual self that had been waiting underneath, and the distance was the source of the quiet exhaustion that did not, by their 70s, have any name they were willing to use. The men who did make the transition, the ones who somewhere in their early 40s began the slow surrender of the 5 things, arrived at the second half with a steadiness the non-transitioners almost never reached. They were not happier in any superficial sense. They were instead finally inside their own life rather than performing one. The first surrender is the hardest because the identity has been with you the longest. Somewhere around 23, 24, 25, depending on where you grew up and what your father did, you took on the identity of the provider. The provider is the man who earns. The provider is the man whose work supports the family. The provider is the man whose worth, in his own quiet self-assessment, is measured by his ability to keep the structure standing. The provider identity was not given to you. You chose it. You chose it because it was the identity the men around you wore, and because choosing it gave you a recognizable shape in the world, and because the alternative, figuring out what your worth actually was, separate from your earning, was harder than just taking on the identity that was already designed for you. The provider identity worked. It got you through your 20s and most of your 30s. It paid for the house and the school fees and the family trips you actually wanted to take. It earned the respect of your father, or at least the silent nod that was the closest your father came to respect. It made you a recognizable man in a world that organized itself around recognizable men. At 43, the provider identity is still working. The income is still coming in. The structure is still standing. But the provider identity has, somewhere underneath, become the only language you have for your own worth. And the language has begun to feel thin. You go to the bathroom mirror in the morning, and the man you see in the mirror is not, you realize quietly, primarily a provider. The provider is the role he has been playing for 18 years. The man underneath has interests the provider never had time for. The man underneath has questions the provider was never paid to ask. The man underneath has, you suspect, an entire other shape that the provider identity has been quietly suffocating. Jung said the first surrender was simple. You do not stop providing. The income still has to come in. The structure still has to stand. What you surrender is the identification with the providing, the unconscious belief that your worth as a man is reducible to your earning. The man underneath the provider has worth that has nothing to do with the earning. Until you can let yourself feel that worth without it being attached to a paycheck, the provider identity will continue to be the only voice you have, and you will continue to feel hollow even when the providing is going well. The body sign of this surrender is precise. You feel it the first time you sit down on a Friday evening and notice with something like relief that the value of the weekend is not what you are going to produce in it. The weekend is just the weekend. You are not in the weekend a provider on temporary leave. You are simply finally a man, and the man is enough. The second surrender is the one most men deny they are still carrying. You are 43. Your father is, depending on circumstance, either alive and in his 70s or dead for some number of years, or geographically distant in a way that mimics absence. You have not in any honest sense needed your father's approval for at least 15 years. You have your own income, your own family, your own decisions, your own life. The need for the approval should, by every reasonable measure, have ended at 30. It did not end at 30. It is still quietly with you. You can notice it in small ways. The decision you almost made about your career 2 years ago and pulled back from, partly because you knew your father would have raised one eyebrow about it. The hobby you do not quite let yourself fully take up, because your father would have considered it slightly frivolous. The clothes you do not quite let yourself wear. The friend you do not quite let yourself fully be. The voice in your own head when you do something that pleases you but would not have pleased him, that says, in his exact cadence, yes, but is that really serious work? Jung observed that the father's voice, internalized somewhere around 11 or 12 years old, did not simply leave when the son became an adult. It went underground. It became the inner critic. The inner critic spoke almost always in the father's exact, even decades after the father had stopped speaking. Even after the father was dead, the cadence persisted, and the son lived inside it without realizing he was living inside it. The second surrender is the slow recognition of the father's voice as the father's voice, separate from your own. Not to reject the father, not to dismiss him, not to do the cheap work of blaming him, to simply notice, quietly, accurately, that the voice in your head saying yes, but is that really serious work, is your father's voice, and that you are 43 years old, and that you no longer require the father's approval to make decisions about your own life, and that you can let his voice be his voice, and let your voice begin to be yours. The body sign of this surrender is also precise. You feel it the first time you make a decision your father would have disapproved of, and the disapproval anxiety does not arrive in your chest. The chest is quiet. The decision is yours. The father remains in his particular shape, the father, but the father no longer lives inside your decisions. You do. The third surrender most men carry without knowing they carry it. You went to high school with 30 other boys. You graduated and went your separate ways. You have, over the years, kept loose track of some of them through reunions, through social media, through mutual friends. You can tell yourself you do not particularly care what they are doing. You can tell yourself you are not in competition with them. But the truth is that you have been quietly competing with them for 25 years. You have been measuring your own life against theirs in a small, private way that no one else has access to. You know with surprising precision who from your class is doing what, who became a partner at a law firm, who started the company that sold for an absurd amount, who quietly disappeared into a Midwestern town and became, by your standard, smaller than expected. You know your position in this private ranking. You have been adjusting it year by year for 25 years. Jung observed that the male peer group at age 15 tended to set the unconscious ranking system the man would carry for the next 40 years. The ranking was almost never articulated. The ranking was almost never examined. The ranking simply ran in the background every day, quietly comparing the man's current state against the imagined trajectories of the boys he had stood next to in chemistry class. The third surrender is to step out of the ranking entirely, not to win it, not to reframe it, not to convince yourself you have already won it, to simply notice calmly that the ranking has been organizing your inner life for 2.5 decades without your conscious permission, and to begin the slow work of asking what your life would feel like if the ranking did not exist at all. The men from your high school class are not, by and large, thinking about you. The ranking exists almost entirely in your own head. It is a remnant of a developmental stage you outgrew at 20, except the remnant did not get outgrown. It just went underground and started running automatically. When you surrender the ranking, You stop comparing your trajectory to the imagined trajectories of men you have not actually spoken to in 15 years. You stop measuring your worth against people who have no idea you are measuring. You begin slowly to live inside your own life rather than inside the comparative life the ranking had been narrating about it. The body sign of this surrender is the absence of a particular tightness in the shoulders when a high school classmate's name comes up. The tightness is not anger. The tightness is the ranking firing automatically. When the ranking finally stops firing, the shoulders, for the first time in 25 years, are quiet. The fourth surrender is the most painful because it requires honesty about the dreams. In your 20s, you had several dreams. Some you pursued. Some you set aside. Some you half pursued and then quietly stopped pursuing without ever formally giving them up. The half-pursued ones, the ones you neither completed nor surrendered, have been with you for 15 or 20 years now as a quiet residue at the edge of your inner life. You can name them if you sit down and force yourself to. The novel you started writing in your second year of graduate school that you have not opened in 12 years. The business you almost started in your late 20s that you still tell yourself vaguely you might still start. The instrument you played in college and have not picked up in a decade. The country you were going to live in for a year and have not yet visited. The half-finished dreams are not, themselves, the problem. The problem is that you have not in 20 years given them clean status. You have not finished them. You have not surrendered them. You have just dragged them quietly year after year as a small private weight of unfinished business that drains energy you do not have an explanation for. Jung wrote that the fourth surrender was the cleanest. It was simply this. The man at 40 had to look honestly at each half-finished dream and decide with full adult intention whether he was going to finish it or surrender it. Either was acceptable. Neither was a failure. What was no longer acceptable was the continued dragging. If you are going to write the novel, write it. Decide. Commit. Make the time. Finish it in a year. The world is not going to give you permission to write it. You have to give yourself permission, and the permission requires that you stop dragging it as a vague possibility and either start it or release it. If you are not going to write the novel, surrender it. Out loud to yourself. Say the words. I am not going to write this novel. The novel is the dream of the 25-year-old I was. The 43-year-old I am has different work. The novel can rest now. The releasing is not a failure. The releasing is the cleaning up of inner space that the dragging has been quietly occupying for 20 years. The body sign of this surrender is the energy that returns when the dragging stops. You did not realize how much energy you had been spending every week holding the half-finished dream in the air. When you set it down, by finishing or by surrendering, the energy comes back, and the energy is enormous, and you have a sudden capacity for the work of the second half that you did not have when the half-finished dreams of the first half were still dragging on your inner ankle. The fifth surrender is the most delicate because it requires you to talk to someone else about it. When you married your wife at 28 or 30 or 32, you were a particular version of you. The version had specific characteristics. He was ambitious in a specific way. He was funny in a specific way. He was emotionally available or unavailable in a specific way. He had specific dreams, specific anxieties, specific weaknesses. Your wife married that version, not the version you would become. Version you were. You are now 15 years later a different man. You are not entirely different. The core is the same. But the version is different. The ambitions have shifted. The interests have deepened in some places and withered in others. The emotional architecture has matured. The man at 43 is in real ways not the man at 28. The marriage, if it is going to survive the second half, has to update. This is what Jung wrote about with particular care. The first half marriage was a contract between two specific versions of two people made at a specific developmental moment. The contract was real. The contract was, often, beautifully fitted to the two people who made it. But the contract was made at 28, and at 43 both people have changed, and the contract has to be renegotiated, not to undo it, but to update it to fit the people who are now actually in it. The fifth surrender is the willingness to begin this renegotiation. To sit down with the woman you married and say, slowly and carefully, that the man she married 15 years ago is not exactly the man sitting across from her now, and that the marriage that worked for those two people is going to need updating to work for the people they have become. To invite her to do the same updating. To let the marriage change shape gently in a way that honors both the contract that was and the people you both now actually are. Most men do not do this fifth surrender. They keep performing the version of themselves their wife married, even after they have internally outgrown it. The performance drains them. The marriage gradually becomes a stage on which two performances meet instead of two actual people. The marriages that survive the second half are the ones where both people, around 40, agree to begin updating the contract. The body sign of this surrender is the relief that arrives the first time you say something honest to your wife about who you have actually become, and she does not pull away, and the conversation continues, and the two of you are, for the first time in years, talking to each other rather than performing for each other. There is one thing Jung said in a letter near the end of his life that most men miss. The 5 surrenders are not individually the second half. The 5 surrenders are what make space for the second half. When the first half identity finally finishes setting itself down, when the provider identity, the father's approval, the high school ranking, the half-finished dreams, and the 28-year-old marriage contract are all quietly surrendered, what remains is space. Just space. An open room where the first half identity used to live. Into that space, slowly and patiently and over years, the actual self walks in. The actual self is not the dramatic figure most men were imagining. The actual self does not arrive in a thunderclap of revelation. The actual self does not usually quit the job and move to the desert. The actual self arrives quietly, almost unnoticeably, as a steady inner presence that the man begins to recognize as himself in a way the first half identity never quite was. The actual self does the same work the provider was doing. The income still comes in. The family still stands. The structure still holds. But the man doing the work is no longer the provider. He is himself, and the providing is one thing among many things that he now is. The career is one shape his life takes, not the shape that defines him. The marriage is a real partnership between two adults who are updating in real time. The relationship with the father is whatever it actually is, without the underground voice. The high school classmates, somewhere underneath, have stopped existing as a ranking. The half-finished dreams have been either finished or surrendered, and the inner ankle is finally free of the drag. This is what Jung called becoming yourself. He did not mean reinventing yourself. He did not mean leaving anything. He meant precisely that the man who finishes the 5 surrenders becomes, for the first time in his adult life, the man he actually is, rather than the man the first half asked him to be in order to build the structure. If you have read this far and you are 43 or 45 or 47, and the kitchen at 11 at night has been quietly waiting for you to begin this conversation, you are not alone. You are simply finally at the developmental door Jung wrote his whole second half work to describe. The door does not open with a dramatic gesture. The door opens with the slow, patient surrender of 5 specific things you have been carrying for 2 decades. You can begin tonight. The view on the other side of the surrender is the only view the second half was ever going to offer you. It is finally your own.